Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. I'm very excited today to have Jeff Smalldon, who is the author of That Beast Was Not Me, One Forensic Psychologist, 5 Decades of Conversations with Killers. You don't get much better of a subtitle than that, Jeff. Jeff is also a resident of Columbus and lived a couple blocks from the bookstore for many years, those years including when you were getting letters from notorious beat generation figures and serial killers. And man, I'm really excited for this conversation and really excited to kick off this podcast with you.
Glad to be here, Grant. Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to talk about a few things. We're definitely going to get into the book, and that's really where I want to start. We're going to talk about your background and your history interviewing these serial killers and just some of the crazy stories that I know you've shared me and some I'm sure that I've never heard before. And then we're going to talk about your Beat Generation Association. You know, I'm a Beat Generation collector, a huge Kerouac fan, and you have really an incredible history having person-to-person contact with people like Gregory Corso and Caroline Cassidy and Allen Ginsberg. And so we'll dive into that in the second part of the episode. But
sounds good.
Let's kick it off. When did you send and why your first serial killer letter?
Well, Manson wasn't a serial killer, but he was my first notorious killer that I attempted to engage. And that's sort of an interesting story. I was a senior in college, pretty naive to crime in general, though my dad had been an FBI agent. So talk of it had always been in kind of the air that I breathed growing up. But I didn't follow the Manson case at all in 1969. I was preparing for my junior year in high school, getting ready for football and, my friends, basically. I didn't follow it at all. But then Helter Skelter came out, and I was just amazed by that book. I couldn't put it down. I read it in a single, all-night, caffeine-fueled binge that began at about 1 o'clock one afternoon and ended about 11 the next morning. And I just thought the case was so interesting. And one day I was taking an abnormal psychology class, and my professor mentioned that he had read Helter Skelter. So I thought, I need to stop and talk with him after class. So I did. And one of the things I said to him after class was, when you read about some of those people who followed Manson and were in his thrall, and you think of their backgrounds, some of them were from backgrounds not unlike my own. And you would sort of get the impression in the media that they were kind of cardboard cutout automatons doing his will. And I said, I wonder if it's a little more complicated than that. And he said, well, have you ever thought of writing them? And of course, that thought had literally never crossed my mind. But I started thinking about it then. And I let it marinate for a couple weeks, and I finally decided, okay, yeah, I'm going to try this. Manson will probably blow me off, but I wrote him at Folsom Prison, and in his first response, he basically said correctly, "You're full of shit. Don't bother me if you're being a phony, but if you're prepared to stop the BS and be honest with me, write me back." So I wrote him back, and I told him a little bit about me, that I'd read Helter Skelter and another book about his case. And then he wrote me back a much different kind of letter. For Manson, almost a contemplative kind of letter, where at one point in the letter he said, "You're my kid, my son, my child, and my reflection. Run to the foot of the cross. They'll do to you what they did to me." And in that first proper letter, he also said, protesting the media portrayal of him, he said, "That beast was not me, but it's what everyone needs me to be, so they make me up to be a reflection of their fears, lies, and bullshit." So that's where the title of my book originates. I had another reason for choosing it too, but that's where it originates.
So what is your reaction getting this letter back from Charles Manson? Do you tell your dad?
Yeah, I did tell my dad. He was still an active special agent with the FBI. I was in college in Indiana. He was at home near Buffalo. I did tell him, and to my dad's great credit, because a lot came after this, including letters from Charles Manson sent to his home when I was there in the summer of 1975. But he never told me I had to stop. I think he thought I was nuts, but he never said, you can't do this. You know, I'm in the FBI. You can't be corresponding with Charles Manson. So he never, you know, he knew I had an academic interest. He didn't think I was going to go off and join the family.
Yeah.
Even though they were trying to get me to.
That's great. What surprised you most about his letters? Anything that really piqued your interest?
Well, they varied a lot in content and tone. Sometimes he was sort of the rambling, performative madman that you would typically see every time he got in front of a camera and mugged and acted the madman. But there were times where he was more thoughtful, like I said in that first proper letter, and where I really felt as though I was able to have a dialogue with him, at least a little bit of a dialogue about some issue. There were other times where he made very little sense, just rambled on about his views about women and kept insisting, you know, I committed no crime. I didn't kill anybody. I don't belong in prison. You know, I was wronged. So I guess the thing that most surprised me was the variation in tone and content in his letters.
And how many years did these letters go on?
Well, with him, it went on for about a year and a half. But there's another chapter that begins at around the same time as my Charles Manson chapter. And that chapter involves a couple of the Manson girls, Squeaky Fromme and Sandra Good. Now, one of the things that I thought was really bizarre about the Manson cases I read about it was the news that some of his followers weren't in prison. I thought, these people are crazy. Surely they're all in prison.
Yeah.
They must be in custody.
Yeah.
And they weren't.
Yeah.
And I knew Squeaky Fromme, who everybody identified as Manson's second in command, was not in prison, but I didn't know where she was. And I had a pretty good idea that wherever she was with her best friend, another Manson devotee, Sandra Good. So I thought, how can I find out where these women live? I should have been smart enough. I wasn't smart about a lot of things then, but I should have been smart enough to know that they wouldn't have moved far from where Manson was. And that turned out to be true. They were in Sacramento. Manson was in Folsom Prison, which are very close. But I didn't know that yet. And I was thinking, you know, how am I going to find them? And then I remembered that in Helter Skelter, there was a paragraph about a member of the prosecutor's office who had befriended the Manson girls who were sitting vigil outside the Hall of Justice in LA. His wife baked them Christmas cookies. And he made the comment, quoted in Helter Skelter, that I like so much of what these people stand for. Their insistence on peace, which, you know, not exactly.
Right.
But that's what he said, you know, something like their emphasis on love and peace and so on. So I thought, this is really a long shot, but is it possible that this guy in the same prosecutor's office that prosecuted Manson would help me find the girls? So I sent Squeaky and Sandy a letter, put it in an envelope, put their names on the envelope, but didn't fill out the address, sent that letter to this guy in the prosecutor's office and said, if you know where Squeaky and Sandy are, would you mind completing this address and sending it to him? I thought, there's no way he's going to do this or write me back. And he did. Wow. Immediately. He wrote me back and said, yeah, I do know where they are. And I sent them your letter yesterday. And then within 3 or 4 days after that, Squeaky Fromme wrote me, and then began a very interesting sequence of letters involving her and Sandy Good, leading up to the end of June 1975.
What was the nature of those letters? What'd she reveal?
Well, I mean, they were fascinating. The first letter that I got from Squeaky Fromme, and I had the idea that she was just this kind of maniacal Manson devotee. And I noticed when the envelope arrived in my mailbox, it was in a floral accented envelope. And I thought, very nice, sort of curly, big handwriting. And that wasn't what I expected. And then I opened the letter, and she immediately starts talking about, she said something like, I can't agree with everything that Vince Bugliosi wrote in Helter Skelter, but I can see that you're coming from no opinion, so that is safe. And I remember thinking, safe? Like, what if I had said something a little different?
Right. She's still out there. Yeah.
Yeah. And, but anyway, that first letter was peace, love, and, our group at the farm was at the ranch was based on our shared understanding of love and so on. And then she said, Charlie didn't do it, Jeff. He is it, with is underlined. And toward the end of the letter, she said, we're really interested in you. Send us a picture and tell us about yourself.
Yeah, did you do that?
I did, but with care.
Yeah.
Well, what I did, I knew she wanted a picture of me. That's what she explicitly asked for. And I thought, I don't really think I want to send them a picture of me. So I talked to a buddy of mine, and he said, no, send them a picture of you, but make sure it's one that doesn't look anything like you look now.
Yeah.
So I found an old picture that really didn't look anything like me, and that's the one that I sent them.
Cool.
It seemed to satisfy their need for a visual image.
And now fast forward the story when the FBI showed up.
Yeah, over a period of about 3 months, her roommate, Sandy Good, took over most of the correspondence. And they were both very intelligent, very well-spoken. Sandy had been an English major in college, which she liked to emphasize in letters to me. And Sandy started out like Squeaky did, kind of love and peace and so on. But then I remember I got a letter from her that began, Dear Jeff, we're running out of words. Words don't do much. It's time for action. I thought, okay. And then began a campaign to interest me in reaching out to some corporate executives who they believed were harming the environment, which was a big cause of theirs at the time. And I thought that letter really got my attention because the tone had shifted to much more serious. And when she said, we're running out of words, it's time for action. But then the letter after that, which I know she sent on June 30th because the date was written in bold marker at the top of the letter, which was about a 14-page handwritten letter. And at the beginning of that letter, she said, well, here's what I want you to do. I want you to call these people, you find out their names, call them at their homes, and tell them, stop harming the environment, or a wave of assassins is going to rush through your homes and splash blood from room to room. Oof. And tell them Manson says, and if they say, who's Manson, say, remember Sharon Tate? And then later on in the letter, they said, if you have any friends who aren't their mommy's little boys and who are ready to spring to action, here's what we'd like you to do.
I'm getting like goosebumps listening to this.
Send them out in the woods, have them kill a hunter, and leave signs on the trees saying, there are hunters hunting hunters. And this letter, she talked about telling people that they're going to get their arms chopped off if they don't do certain things. And I was like, okay, time to find an exit ramp, Jeff. You probably should have found one before this, but you need one now. And so I had an undergraduate friend of mine who lived in Wisconsin, and I wrote Squeaky and Sandy a letter, enclosed it in an envelope to my friend, and said, will you send this letter to get a Wisconsin postmark? Mm-hmm. And the content of the letter was me telling them I've moved from Western New York, where they had been sending letters to my parents' home, because that's where I was spending the summer. And I'm hitchhiking around for the summer, so I'm not going to have a fixed address. And they bought it. Literally the next thing I heard was September 5th, 2 months later, national headlines screamed, Squeaky Frommie has attempted to assassinate President Ford. So my sense that, man, these women are getting desperate was accurate. Yeah. And so then after the assassination attempt, my dad was still assigned to the Buffalo office of the FBI at the time. And he and I were in regular contact then. And he calls me one day. I was working on my master's in English at Purdue at the time. And he says, Jeff, my boss called me in today and he says the FBI in Sacramento found a large cache of letters in Squeaky's apartment with our return address on them. And he said, so I had to explain that to my boss. And I said, well, I hope you were able to. I hope it wasn't too awkward. And he said, no, I took care of it.
So you had this insight into the increasing impending violence in them. Were you already a forensic psychologist? Is this when you're studying to be one? Tell us a little bit about your career trajectory.
The thought of becoming a forensic psychologist had never even entered my mind at this point. I was a 21-year-old senior in college when it began, and then I went to Purdue the year after and continued. But literally, I had never thought of becoming a forensic psychologist. I was going to get my PhD in English and be an English professor. That was the plan. And then after I got my master's at Purdue, I went back to my alma mater, taught in the English department for a year. Then I got a grant to study modern Irish literature at Trinity College in Dublin. I had a fantastic year. Nothing about that year made me decide not to continue with my study of literature because I loved it. But it gradually dawned on me that year that I didn't think I would be happy in an academic environment with the publish and perish mentality that reigned in most English departments at the time. So, and this is a really, to me, very interesting part of my story, which is sort of a bizarre story by any barometer. I come home from Ireland, no idea what to do. So I decided, well, maybe I'll be an FBI agent like my dad. Would have turned out to be a very bad choice, but I decided to give it a try. I held my dad in very high esteem, and I thought maybe I can be an FBI agent. So he arranged for me to take the test to get into the FBI, and there were actually 3 tests. There was a personality inventory, something they called a test of general knowledge, and a spelling test of all things. And I aced the spelling test, and the agent who administered the test said, you got the highest score we've had in a long time on that general information test, but there's a problem with the personality inventory. And I said, what would that be? And he said, well, you seem to be the sort of person who doesn't easily bend to authority or accept authority from your superiors. And my internal dialogue was, well, gee whiz. No kidding. But he said, I'll tell you what, he was a friend of my dad's. He said, I'll let you take the test again, but here's what I want you to have as your mindset to take the test again. And he said, I want you to think that you're in the military, where hierarchy and so on is very important. Keep that in mind when you answer these questions. So I gave it my best shot. He comes back and said, sorry, you didn't fool the personality test. It came back exactly the same.
That's funny.
So I wasn't going to be an FBI agent. So what was I going to become? My mom was a nurse at the local hospital, and she said, have you ever thought of hospital administration? And I said, no, what is it? I'd never heard of hospital administration. She said, I don't really know what it is either. But down at the hospital, there are a couple of nice looking young men, and I think they're called hospital administrators. And they always say hi to me in the hallway when I pass them. They're very friendly. Why don't you go down and talk to one of them? So I did. And this guy I liked him, and he seemed to like me. And he said, I'll tell you what you do, Jeff. Go and do your master's at George Washington University, which is where he had done one of the best healthcare administration graduate programs in the country. And then after you finish your master's, come back and work for me. And it kind of sounded like a job offer. And I didn't have anything better going on. So I thought, okay. So I applied only to that one school. If I hadn't gotten accepted, I would have done God knows what else. But I did get accepted. They must have seen me as some kind of bizarre sleeper candidate because I'd never taken a business class in my life, but they admitted me and gave me a very generous financial package. So I went there, and this is where begins sort of the second big chapter, the second of 3 big chapters in my story. we had to do a 1-year residency at a hospital somewhere in the country as the second half of our master's degree. And I had friends who did theirs in San Diego, San Francisco, Boston, St. Louis, all over the country. I end up going to Columbus, Ohio, to Riverside Methodist Hospital. I'd never been to Ohio before. I'd never been to Columbus before, but I was sent there to do my residency. This was in 1982, 83. And I made friends during that residency, and I think seemed like a striver, and they asked me to stay on after my residency. And I was a good instance of the imposter phenomenon. I thought, I don't really know much about how to run a hospital.
Right.
I'm able to get along with most people.
Right.
But at some point I'm going to be exposed.
Right.
Well, before I could be exposed, I kept getting promotions. And in December of 1983, I was an assistant vice president. And I had responsibility for the 138-bed psychiatric and addiction program. And then another of the departments I had responsibility for was a very small medical research lab, about 7 employees total. A tiny room, like the size of an average living room, with a single door going in and out. And it was located right around the corner from the hospital's main hallway. Well, I went home to my parents in Western New York for the Christmas holidays that year, and I get a call from the director of public relations, and she says, Jeff, I've got terrible news. There's been a tragedy. And I said, what? I mean, I was expecting something horrible had happened on the psychiatric unit, because we had a couple of suicides. One man killed his young daughter taking a walk around the hospital. So I'm expecting some news like that. And she says Joyce McFadden and Patty Maddox were murdered in the research lab Friday afternoon between 4:30 and 5 o'clock. I said, no way. I mean, nothing could have surprised me more. I said, no way. And she said, yeah, nobody saw anybody leave or any suspicious activity. The police have made no arrests. So I said, well, I'll be back in Columbus within a couple days. And I did come back. But I remember thinking, what is going on here? There was the Manson chapter, which was like 8 years before, but I thought I'd kind of left that behind. And now 2 of these employees who I knew, they worked in a department that reported to me, were murdered. I said, like, it feels like murder is following me. I couldn't figure it out. And like many people at the hospital, I was traumatized by that news and found going to work every day after that very stressful. We all had our theories about who had done it. My theory was that someone who I was having to meet with daily had done it. I was wrong. But at the time, I thought that this person, who was the first person on the scene, who found the first woman's body, was the one who had probably done it. Again, I want to emphasize that I was wrong. But it added to my stress that, I was having to deal with this person who seemed like a grieving coworker.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if he murdered these 2 women. So time went on, there were no arrests made, and I finally thought, I really can't do this. I don't want to do this anymore. I was never meant to be a businessman anyway, and I sure don't really have the skills to be a competent one if I did want to be one. I'm going to go back to Ohio State, work on my PhD in psychology, eventually open up a private practice where I want to become a forensic psychologist and gain for myself a close vantage point from which to study the minds and motivations of killers, including whoever killed my 2 coworkers. And that's what I did. And then the 3rd chapter of my story is the 25 years I spent as a forensic psychologist.
So before we jump into that next chapter, who did it?
It's a long story, but a very interesting one. It's still officially a cold case. But about 2.5 years after the murders. Again, no arrests made. I opened up the Columbus Dispatch one morning on my porch, and the headline is "Worst Shootout in FBI History. 2 agents killed in Miami, 4 agents injured, 2 suspects killed." I was always interested in FBI-related news, and my dad was still in the FBI, he was about, I guess, to transition out. But I'm reading down the story, and halfway down the first column, it says the 2 suspects who were suspected of committing a number of brazen daytime robberies where they would wear camouflages. They were suspected of at least 1 murder, were Michael J. Platt and William Maddox, whose wife was murdered under unusual circumstances in Columbus, Ohio, 2.5 years ago. This is down in Miami. And I thought, wait, Bill Maddox, that like very somber, religious seeming Baptist whose hand I shook at the memorial service and offered him condolences, he was involved in this crime spree in Miami. And everyone who knows anything about the case assumes that one or both of them did it, he or this Michael Platt, who was an old Army buddy of his. And here's one really ultra creepy detail from that story. At the time of these women's murder, he and his wife, one of the victims, had a 4-month-old child. And he apparently hooked up with his old buddy, thought, this life I'm leading in Columbus is a bore. I need something more stimulating and exciting. They go down to Florida and get involved in this crime spree. He remarries, fathers at least 2 children down there. But years later, I had lunch with one of the homicide detectives who was most closely involved in that case. And we talked about it, and he said, yeah, I have no doubt that he was one of the killers. Either he did it himself, the other guy did it, or they did it together. Another interesting little detail, which I thought was enlightening. Not long ago, like within the last 6 months, I was contacted by a former family physician at Riverside who had been the first medical professional on the scene. The guy who found the first body went screaming out into the hall, and Dr. Ed Bope was there and went in and found that the woman had no pulse. So he was like the second person on the scene. And he got in touch with me. I hadn't seen Ed in years. And he said, I read your book and found the chapter on the Riverside murders very interesting. Are you interested in my recollections of that period? I said, absolutely. So he sent me a sort of a handwritten letter with summarizing his impressions and memories. And one interesting thing he said was, I immediately noticed when I went into the lab that the woman on the floor had no defensive wounds at all. She'd been stabbed 19 times in the chest and face, but she was arranged carefully on the floor and no defensive wounds. And I immediately said to myself, 2 people were involved. Someone would have had to hold her from the back while someone did the stabbing in the front. One person couldn't have controlled her in that way. And I never really thought of that. I wasn't really involved in the crime scene analysis of that, but I thought that was a fascinating observation. And that came many, almost 40 years after the murders or so. So anyway, at that point, it seemed like, different tributaries of my life were coming together.
So let's move into that forensic psychology phase. Is it kind of like being a homicide detective? You have these sort of deep attention to detail. You're already in this conversation connecting minute strands. You've memorized parts of letters. You're coming up with hypotheses. I know you and I have talked a little bit about the John Bonet case and your theory around that. You have such a
Don't get me going down that rabbit hole.
We might get there. We might get there. But tell us, what is it like being a forensic psychologist for someone who has no idea?
Well, I appreciate you asking that question, because a lot of people have the idea that people like me who are in private practice as a forensic psychologist do profiling. Like, in other words, becoming involved as a consultant to law enforcement before a suspect is arrested. But that's not what I did at all. And very few psychologists in private practice do that. There are a few psychologists affiliated with the FBI's behavioral science unit that do that, but I never did. I worked on about 300 death penalty cases in state and federal court in Ohio, arising from about 55 different counties. So I worked all over Ohio over 25 years. And I would typically, on those death penalty cases, I would get hired after a suspect was arrested. And the defense attorneys, who were obviously the ones who had a client needing to be assessed, would typically hire me. And the charge was usually, excuse me, we want you to keep us informed about any issues that might be relevant to the defense, any mental health issues that might be relevant. In other words,
are they crazy?
Crazy or insanity refers to the state of their mind at the time the offenses were committed. Like, is there any reason to believe that at the time the offenses were committed, they were, because of mental health issues, unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct? That almost never happens. I can remember maybe one death penalty case where that was a serious issue, but typically wasn't. The other central mental health issue was, are they competent to proceed? Can they assist defense counsel? Can they understand, the important elements of
fit to be tried.
A legal case? Yeah, are they fit to be tried? And so my job in those cases would be to do multiple interviews with the defendant, do a battery, often a combined battery of psychological as well as neuropsychological tests, and to do interviews with collateral sources of information, family members, in some cases former coaches, teachers. And death penalty trials really take place in two parts. The first part is the guilt innocence phase, which we're all familiar with from watching TV, And there was seldom any suspense in these death penalty cases. Almost always, everyone knew who did it. Not always, but most of the time. So after the jury rendered a guilty verdict, then came the second part of the trial, usually referred to as the mitigation or sentencing part of the trial. And that really becomes the defense's show at that point, to put on information about the defendant that the jury may or may not find relevant to their sentencing decision, but that might convince them to arrive at something other than a death sentence. And that's where I would get called on to act as an expert witness, educate the jury. I never acted as an advocate for the defendant. And I never acted as an advocate for the defense cause. Even though I'm personally opposed to the death penalty, which came into play during my career, it's a major issue, I was never there to convince the jury not to sentence someone to death or to argue in favor of a life sentence. That was the job of the attorneys, not me. I saw myself as an educator there to share with the jury what I had learned in my investigation.
So of all the people that you're interviewed over the years, is there one that really stuck with you, that really, gave you the creeps, or just was someone who really twisted your mind, who you thought they were one way, but they were some other way? Any that really pop out?
Well, it's funny, Grant, the one that immediately pops out is not one that I evaluated as a forensic psychologist. It's someone, and I'll tell you who in a minute, that I became involved with while I was in graduate school. And that's notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy.
Yeah, let's talk about Gacy. We got some Gacy paintings here behind me.
We do.
We've got let's. How did you get introduced to John Wayne Gacy?
Well, can I back up just one step?
Sure.
So I'm beginning graduate school, and the Riverside murders remain unsolved, and that's still, preying on my mind. But I'd started graduate school at Ohio State, and I thought, well, who could I engage? I was pretty successful with Manson years ago. Who might I engage now who would at least have the potential to share information with me that might be helpful eventually in my career, but right now, and maybe understanding the person who committed the murders at Riverside? And I thought, well, one person who comes to mind is Ted Bundy, who's on death row in Florida under 2 separate death sentences. So I wrote Bundy. This was in 1985, same year I started graduate school. I wrote him a long handwritten letter. I thought that was more personal than typing it. And he would have known from reading my letter that I knew a lot about his case. I think I had read at least 4 books about his case by that time. And at the end of what I was interested in is engaging him in a dialogue, and that's what I told him. But at the end of the letter, I said, if you don't write me back, you'll never hear from me again. I'm not trying to bother you, so if you choose not to write back, that'll be the end of it. And he didn't write back, so I thought, okay, well, that's the end of that. Well, a year later, I get a letter in my Pasemont, East Pasemont mailbox with the return address Ted Bundy. And the letter is fascinating. It starts out, Dear Jeffrey, I'm sorry it's taking me such an inordinately long time to respond to your letter. Right about the time you wrote, I retreated into a cocoon, and I've been there ever since. But I've kept your letter all this time amongst my papers, sounding very much like a snooty professor. Mm-hmm. And then he says, ask for your questions. All I can say is I found them very thoughtful and interesting. I've never felt better in my life than I feel right now. He's on death row, under 2 death sentences. Spiritually, mentally, physically. I hope the same can be said for you. And then this is the best part. This guy who's known for the incredible distances he would travel in search of victims. He killed women in Washington State, Oregon, Colorado, Florida, Utah. So, and he knows that I know that's kind of what he's known for. And he signs off the letter, take care, watch yourself, travel light, peace, Ted. And I remember I read that and I thought, wow, not too many people end their letters that way. What does that mean?
Yeah.
And then when I thought about it, I thought, well, he's being clever. It's an inside joke. He knows I'll get it. That's a weird kind of flattery, but he knows I'll get it. And on one hand, it could be read as a recipe for how to avoid people like him. Be watchful, be mindful, know where you are, know who's with you, be able to move quickly if you need to. But read another way, and I think he enjoyed this part too, it can be seen as a recipe for how to succeed if you're a predator like him. Always be watchful, be on guard, be light, be mobile, be ready to move. And I thought, it was fascinating. And I know he knew all that and thought he was being very clever. But anyway, so after, I didn't write him back. That was, for me, the end of the Bundy chapter. But I learned something significant from that, and that's the serial killer's penchant for the tease. They enjoy that kind of hiding in plain sight, luring you, baiting you into their orbit. They all enjoy that. I came to understand that later. But after that correspondence with Bundy ended, I thought, I'm still in graduate school. Who else might I engage? And I thought of John Wayne Gacy on death row in Illinois. So I wrote Gacy, and his first response was not unlike Manson's first response, which was basically to say I was full of shit. He said, I don't care how many books you've read about my case. You don't know a thing about me from those books. And then he ended on a gentler note. He said something like, take care, write me back. He wanted me to write him back again. So I did, and that was the beginning of a 3-year correspondence. We exchanged letters about, on average, every 2 weeks. And about 8 months into that correspondence, he said, why don't you come visit me? It was 450 miles away, but with my wife's blessing, I said, okay. And he said, when you come, make sure you don't sign in as a psychologist or a journalist because they won't let you in. Sign in as a friend. So that's what I did. Mm. And, I ended up spending about 20 hours with him. I made 2 separate trips out there, 2 days each time. And so spent 20 hours in close quarters.
Like at a table like this?
Yeah, a narrow table. And, one of the things that happened is he was so obsessive compulsive. He kept a log of everything, like every piece of incoming mail, every meal he had, every painting he did. And at one point he wanted to show me his log and some photograph albums that he brought out. So he asked me to come around to his side of the table. And I remember thinking, despite the fact that he's being pretty congenial with me, this is a guy who it's probably fair to assume has some impulse control problems. He had 26 bodies in the crawl space under his house, and killed an additional 7. So I thought, I don't know that I want to sit right next to him, where even though he's got handcuffs on and leg manacles, it'd be pretty easy to put those handcuffs over my head and squeeze my neck.
This is immediately what's going through your head.
This is what's going through my head. So
within milliseconds of him saying, come over here.
Exactly, because I don't want to communicate fear to him. So I go over to his side of the table, but I position my feet so I can make a quick move if I need to. But back to Bundy's travel light, I guess. But I spent quite a bit of time on the same side of the table with him. And that moment in my time with him came after another moment that actually serves as the prologue in my book. And this was, it was sort of incredible. I've driven 450 miles out there, and this corrections officer takes me through all these locked gates and rooms and so on before I get to death row, where Gacy is. And I'm about to meet Gacy for the very first time. I've never met him before. And the guard opens this giant steel gate, and he says, you and Mr. Gacy will be in that second room to the right. And just as I'm about to walk in, he says, can I just pause for a minute? I said, yeah. And he says, I assume that you know why Mr. Gacy is on our condemned unit. That's what he called it. And I said, I do. And he said, I know you've traveled a long way to get here. I just want to remind you of something. Once you go back there, no one else is going to be on your side of this steel gate. So if anything goes awry back there, or God forbid, should a hostage situation develop, you'll be on your own. We don't negotiate with inmates. That's institutional policy. Do you understand? And I said, yeah. What else would I wasn't going to bail out at that point. But those words came back to me about 4 hours into that first day. I was so shaken by that exchange. It was all internal, but that got my attention, that I forgot to ask him if there was a restroom back there, because I had had a lot of coffee that morning. I knew I would need a restroom. So I didn't ask him that. And about 3 hours into my conversation with Gacy, I'm starting to have to pee. And then about 4 hours into it, it's becoming a significant issue. I really can't put it off any longer. So I did what I had no choice but to do, which was engage a serial sex killer in my search for a restroom. So I say to Gacy, John, is there a restroom back here? And he says, hell no, like I was some idiot. And he says, no, you're going to have to go out and yell for the guards, and they're off playing poker somewhere. You probably won't even be able to get their attention. And he was right, I couldn't. I went out in the hallway and yelled for the guards and couldn't get their attention. Then I go back to the room where Gacy is sheepishly, and he's heard me yelling, and he's got this big grin on his face. He's loving it, loving that he's got me, like, under his control.
There's no guards. Like a big grin?
Oh, yeah. Oh, he was enjoying it immensely. And he says, when I say yell, I mean yell. Go out there and really yell, and maybe they'll pay attention to you.
Yeah.
So I go out again and really roared, guard. And finally, the guard who had brought me in the morning emerged from God knows where and says, can I help you? I mean, it's like the passive-aggressive thing that you kind of expect in prisons, I'm afraid. And I said, yeah, I really need to use the restroom. It's kind of an emergency. And so, I mean, that told me how little the room Gacy and I were in was being monitored. I mean, there was a video camera on the wall, but nobody was paying any attention. So I knew that fact by the time I was going over to sit next to him on his side of the table.
Did you ever feel threatened? Did you feel scared? Did you...
I didn't, though I was wary. I should have been more wary than I was, but I was wary when he asked me over to his side of the table. Later, and I cover this in my book at the end of the chapter on Gacy, some years later, when Gacy was much closer to being executed, by this time he would have known the jig is up and my appeals are expired, I'm going to be executed. Big difference, because when I was with him, he still at least was hoping maybe he could get his death sentence overturned. So maybe he was kind of on his best behavior with me. But when this young man who wrote a book about it called The Last Victim, Jason Moss, went to see him, Moss had postured in letters to Gacy as what he saw as Gacy's ideal victim, sexually confused adolescent boy, open to Gacy's, sharing fantasies about sex. And he went to visit Gacy, and his account in his book is terrifying. It was obvious to me he was in the same room I was in with Gacy, and Gacy attacked him. Like, I mean, it would have become physical, and this Jason Moss was a martial arts expert, so I don't know what would have happened if it would have become physical, but, Gacy convinced him, sent him home to his hotel the first night with a bracelet that Gacy wanted him to wear. Gacy gave him a pair of underwear that he wanted him to wear the next day when he came back. Moss didn't wear the underwear, but he did wear the bracelet to show Gacy that he had done that at his request. And Gacy just started verbally attacking him and saying, you little punk, I'm going to rape you on the floor and there'll be blood all over and nobody will be here to help you. It'll just be you and me. And, and it got physical at times. Gacy invaded his space and Moss was very afraid. But when I read that, I thought, oh man, I should have been more wary than I was.
So how'd you get the paintings?
Well,
tell us about them.
Yeah, I mean, Gacy was so grandiose. He would say in the same sentence, I'm really not a painter, but then compare himself to Da Vinci and Michelangelo. He would say, those are my primary models. And he would bring paintings out to our meetings and lean them up against the wall. And he would say, I'm not pressing you to buy one of these, Jeff, but that's how I buy stationery and postage. So, and this is funny. He said, I really encourage you to buy a couple now because their value is going to appreciate over time a lot. So you should get them now while they're cheap. Yeah. So I bought one. I'll tell you the story of this one day. We're talking, and the painting that was leaning against the wall that day was one of his favorite subjects, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It was a painting of the dwarfs at the mouth of the mine. And this is a guy, again, who had 26 bodies in the crawl space under his house. So there's a shovel shown at the mouth of the mine in these 7 dwarfs. And I'm trying to get Gacy to talk with me about some of the murders. He's mostly denying any of them. He eventually told me he knew something about 5 of them. So I decided to try and work on those and get him to talk about them. And at some point during that discussion, he said, you know what, Jeff? I've got pictures of every one of those kids who they say I killed back in my cell. And he positioned his hands like you would if you were holding a deck of cards. And he said, I go through those pictures, and you know what? Those kids are no more real to me than, and he was sort of casting about for how to complete that sentence. And his eye caught that painting of the 7 dwarfs. And he said, then those cartoon characters in that painting. And I remember thinking, that is probably the first true statement he's made all day long. That's absolutely the truth, that they were no more real to him than the cartoon characters in that painting. So that was one painting story. Another was he offered to do a custom painting for me. And he said, what do you want me to do? And he suggested a couple of alternatives. And one of them was a replica of Picasso's famous drawing of Don Quixote on his steed. And he said, I've done that before. I think I can paint that pretty well. And how about if I put your initials on the shield? Because I see you as a quester after the truth. So I said, okay, go ahead and paint that. Yeah. And I remember thinking, this is literally one of the 20th century's most prolific liars. And he's calling me a quester after the truth and putting my initials on Don Quixote's shield. And I have another, he gave me and my wife, really, he gave Betsy, I think, 1 painting, and then I bought 2 others for $30 each. And I know now that they've appreciated by thousands. Yeah. So he was correct.
Yeah, that's amazing. So let's pivot now into the Beat generation. We've covered the serial killers, your career. When did you start getting into the Beats?
Well, back when I was working on my master's at Purdue and thinking that I was going to have a career in academia, I had read On the Road back around that time, 1975, 76. And like so many other people, it just, sort of blew me away. I was just so taken with the poetic language and the travel, the whole thing. And I thought at some point here, I'm going to need to come up with a dissertation subject. Maybe I'll write about Kerouac or about the Beats. So that idea was in the back of my brain, but I didn't do anything about it. But at some point, and it was around the same time that I was, sending these letters to Bundy and Gacy, I decided to write Neil Cassidy's widow, Carolyn, who I knew lived in Los Gatos, California at the time. Again, not knowing whether it would go anywhere. And Carolyn immediately wrote me back, seemed very interested in my interest in her and Kerouac and Cassidy and so on. And she and I became involved in a pretty intense correspondence that lasted, toward the end, our letters exchanges weren't as regular as they had been at the beginning, but our correspondence spanned about 20 years. And twice my wife and I went over to London, visited her. She cooked us a wonderful lamb dinner at her flat in Hampstead the first time we went. And I just need to work this in because it's such a great story. The second time we went, she had us up to her flat and she says, I've got 2 visitors here. And she introduced Al Hinkle, who I knew immediately who he was. He was one of Neil's best friends from Denver growing up. And he was Big Ed Dunkel in On the Road, and he featured in other Kerouac novels as well. So I thought, Al Hinkle, wow, that's cool. I didn't say anything like that, but I said, glad to meet you, Al. And then she said, the other woman, she said, this is Anne Murphy. And I thought, Anne Murphy? Anne Murphy was Neil's final girlfriend. He had others, but she was his kind of steady girlfriend between 1962 and the time that he died. And so there's Anne Murphy dressed in a lime green warm-up suit doing yoga on the floor with Al Hinkle in the corner.
That's great.
And I was trying to figure it out, like Al Hinkle and Anne Murphy, why are they together? And Carolyn said, yeah, Al and Anne are traveling. They're embarking on a trip together to Europe, and this was their first stop.
Wow.
And it just happened to be when we were there.
When you were there?
So that was really cool.
So tell me some of the things that are in these Caroline Cassidy letters. What did you talk about over a 20-year period? That's such a long time.
And she was a great correspondent. I mean, she wrote long typed letters. And she talked a lot about Kerouac, Ginsberg, Neil, other members of the so-called Beat Generation. And I would say the primary theme, Carolyn was very opinionated and very gracious woman, very intelligent. You know, she went to Bennington College. Her dad was a physician, not the person you would think would end up with Denver Skid Row kid Neil Cassidy, but she did. And she was very eager to counter the narrative of Neil as this wild man. She emphasized how spiritual he was. They were both involved in kind of a spiritual quest that took them to Edgar Casey. They both believed in past lives. She talked a lot about that. I can't find these, but I need to. She did very colorful, very detailed horoscopes for both my wife and me.
Wow.
They're multicolored, beautifully done.
That's cool.
And I have them. I need to find them.
That's amazing.
But yeah, that was really cool when she did that. One of the, before I get to the other beats, one other thing I wanted to mention about Carolyn, she published, a very well-regarded memoir from her perspective called Off the Road, I think My Life with Cassidy, Kerouac, and Ginsberg. And by this time, she's living in London. She's left California. She's living in London, which, interestingly, she said it's where she was always meant to be. She thought England was her home, not America. So she's living in England, but she sent me the first English edition of her memoir, which is with a beautiful, very generous, kind inscription in it. But the thing that makes it so cool is, one of the signature moments in that whole story of her, Neil, and Jack was when Jack was staying with them in the early 50s, probably 51 or so. She talks about them going out to taverns. They'd go and spend the evening and play songs on the jukebox. And she describes this scene where she and Jack and Neil go to this bar, and they're playing music, and Jack wants to dance. He's jumping up, and Neil doesn't want to dance. He's bouncing around the room, engaging everybody in conversation, doesn't want to dance. So Jack and Carolyn dance. And while they're dancing, she says, Jack is not coming on to her, but she can feel, the energy from him, that he's attracted to her. She's very attracted to him. And he whispers in her ear, no, Carolyn, you're Neil's girl. And just weirdly, in the English edition of her memoir, they omitted that line from the bottom of one page, and she wrote in the line in longhand.
So cool.
Yeah, and then put her initials in parentheses, and it was very cool.
So what kind of questions are you asking her? Are you, in terms of her writing all of this sort of intimate recollection about Kerouac and Cassidy, are you prompting this? Are you the ultimate questioner in your dialoguing?
I'm prompting it. Like, I'm nobody's world-class Kerouac expert, but back then, I had read pretty much everything I could get my hands on. So I was pretty knowledgeable, much more knowledgeable back then than I am now. But I knew a lot of questions to ask her, and she wrote a lot about the time that Kerouac spent with them. I remember she was quite disparaging of Ginsberg, even though he was a close friend, remained a friend till the end of her life, but she thought that he was consumed by ego and that got in his way a lot of the time. As I said, she was very eager to emphasize Neil's spiritual side, which she thought had been underemphasized in almost all of the biographies. You know, one of the biographies you and I were talking about the other day by Gerald Nicosia, Memory Babe, had been written not long before. And he called Carolyn while Betsy and I were there for dinner with her and wanted her to meet him for dinner. And she said, "No, Jerry, I got company. I can't meet you tonight."
I love that.
Which I thought was cool that, we were preempting Jerry, who had written this immense, very detailed biography. But anyway, I mean, I sort of knew the biographies, and so I had a lot of questions to ask her. And she was, like I said, a great correspondent. Very literate, very articulate, typed her letters, but she always sent me birthday cards, Christmas cards, and it was just very kind and considerate. Toward the end of her life, I mean, she got pretty crotchety, cranky, and was difficult, I think, toward the end of her life. No great surprise, but she was.
So what about Corso? How'd you run into Gregory Corso?
My wife and I was doing my 1-year pre-doctoral internship at a state psychiatric hospital in Connecticut. We were there from 88 to 89, August 88 to August 89, I guess. And in December of 88, we went into New York City to see the lights and, And I remember it was a terrible sloshy day, dirty snow all over and so on. And I said to my wife, we're walking around Greenwich Village, and I said, there's the kettle of fish. That figures pretty prominently in the Kerouac story. Let's go in and have a beer. So we open the door, and I immediately hear the nasal voice of Gregory Corso. Couldn't possibly miss it. Yeah. And I said, that's Gregory Corso sitting at the bar. And Betsy knew enough to know that was him, too, even though she wasn't so much of a beat enthusiast, but she knew that was Gregory Corso. And so we sat at the bar listening to him jabbering down the bar in his very distinctive voice. And I'm trying to figure out how to engage him, how to become part of his day.
Yeah.
And I didn't know how to do it. And he gets up to leave. He's heading for the door. And I think, oh, crap, I missed the opportunity. So I said, excuse me, Gregory, can I buy you a beer? And he says, I don't really want a beer, but can I propose something else? I said, absolutely. And he said, let's fill out a lottery ticket together. So I said, okay, cool. I'd never filled out a lottery ticket in my life. Yeah. Knew nothing about it, but he did. So he gets this lottery ticket. And I mean, it was incredibly entertaining.
He's so
he was
alive.
Always entertaining.
Yeah.
Anything he would do, including something, so simple as a lottery ticket. He's like choosing numbers based on Shelley's birth date and, all kinds of crazy. He's been covering his eyes and, doing sort of a pin the tail on the donkey kind of thing. And we get done with it. And I say, well, what if we win? Yeah. Like, how will I even know? And he says, here's Ginsey's number. So he writes Ginsberg's phone number, which I later confirmed was in fact Ginsberg's phone number, and signs his name on it. And he said, if we win, just contact Ginsey. He'll always know where I am. And then he goes into the payphone. Back then they had these open payphones with the doors closed. And I'm overhearing him on the phone, and he's saying, what do you mean they changed their number? You're a hospital. And it turns out that Ginsberg was in the hospital having his gallbladder removed, and Corso decided to dial him up, I guess, to tell him about this lottery card, and he couldn't get hold of him. And he comes storming out of there all pissed off because he couldn't get to Ginsberg.
That's awesome.
But then he says, "Come with me." And he's like the Pied Piper. He's leading Betsy and I through the streets of Greenwich Village, and he's saying, yeah, that's where Kerouac used to hang out with the lesbians. This is where this happened. This is where...
That's
cool.
And
he went to the place where he wanted to turn in the lottery ticket.
Yeah.
And then we came back to the Kettle of Fish.
That's awesome. Yeah, I have some original Kettle of Fish photographs that were taken of Kerouac in 57, right before...
And of course, it had changed locations.
Yeah,
by the time
exactly.
I was there.
On the Road came out, and it's really nice to see that neon sign in the
Yeah.
back, the one that's on the cover of the Minor Characters Joyce Johnson book. So I have all those original Type 1 photos, and
that's
one of them's
awesome.
hanging in my study. Not the famous one, actually. I have
From
one
the
of
cover,
him
you mean?
from the cover. I have it.
Yeah.
But it's just sitting in a frame, actually, just against a bookshelf in
Wow,
my...
that's
I'm going to
awesome.
actually probably sell that one. I bought a lot of 4 of them. I have one of him actually drinking in the bar, and he's got this very alive, kind of
fantastic.
amazing look. So that's the one that's actually on my wall. Yeah, there's actually one that he hardly looks like him. It's fascinating. He's actually had gone back into the kitchen, this back kitchen area, and was talking with some dishwashers or something, and then he was like coming back through the door.
Who
and
took these?
He looked.
Fred McDera?
No, not McDera. There's someone else. His name is Donald. I'm just blanking on his last name. Yeah, I'll send them to you. But he's coming out of the kitchen. I mean, I can just bring them and show them. And he almost looks like a fisherman or something, like a Massachusetts, like
No, he kind of had
Quebecois. But he has
look.
this kind of burliness to him. He doesn't even look like him. It's very surprising. And in fact, I was looking through them. I bought them from a dealer in Baltimore, and I was looking through them, and this one caught my eye, and I was like, that doesn't even look like.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'd love to see it.
Yeah, they're really beautiful. So tell us a little bit more about your Beat Generation associations. I know you've got Ginsberg, signed postcards, and you used to have a Burroughs one. I bought that from you, as well as the Paul Bowles. But how'd you get those postcards?
Well, I mean, I never really knew Ginsberg, though I did see him here in Columbus in summer of 1985. There was a Poetry in the Park series at Park of Roses in Whetstone. And my wife and I went and saw Ginsberg.
How was that?
It was great. I mean, he was playing his harmonium, and I had him sign a few things afterward. He was very cordial. But then after that, I decided to write to him. I can't remember what I wrote him. And he was pretty prickly with me. I asked him something about the poem Bird Brain, and he didn't think I got it. I missed the point. And this is funny. And Ginsberg was so compulsive that I don't think he could take a letter even from someone who he thought missed the point of Bird Brain and just crumple it up and throw it in the trash. Instead, he heads his postcard 2 a.m. answering irrational mail. Yeah. And then he says, "Dear Jeff," and writes the rest of it.
That's crazy.
And I got about 3 or 4 other postcards from him. But I got the idea around that time that there was this well-known series of black and white postcards of photographs that Ginsberg had taken. And I thought it would be really cool if I sent postcards, blank postcards, to people who were involved in some of these famous pictures and invited them to write a caption on the back. I just thought that would be really cool.
And it is cool.
So I sent one to William Burroughs, who lived in Lawrence, Kansas, and I don't think was known to be a big correspondent but I sent one to him that was, I think it was the same one who I sent Paul Bowles, who I'll tell you about in just a minute, but of the famous picture in Tangier.
Yeah, it is that one.
Mikey, who's a good, the guy who was sort of the electronics guy, but he's in it, Corso's in it, Paul Bowles, Burroughs, I guess Ginsberg took the picture. But Burroughs answered it, and he recalled a couple memories from that day. And then Paul Bowles, who, is a notorious expat living in Morocco.
Yeah.
And I knew that at a time he had lived in a place there. I didn't know Tangier or Morocco or any place in North Africa, but I knew he had lived in a hotel called the Hotel Muniria. So I thought, I'm just going to take a chance that maybe he's still there, that maybe that's still where he lives. So I sent this letter to him, care of the Hotel Muniria, and he got it. And he responded to it in some detail, recalling that day Ginsberg had brought his camera that day. And
exactly where it was.
Yeah, talking about, and how they assembled the people for the photo shoot. And I thought, that's really cool, because Paul Bowles, I don't think, is known for responding to people who contact him out of the blue.
And you had a number of Ginsberg ones as well.
Number of Ginsberg ones. I sent one to Gary Snyder, which was a picture Ginsberg had taken of Snyder sitting on the ground in the Cascade Mountains. Beautiful picture.
That's in my personal collection now.
Yeah,
that's not going anywhere.
I know, and that's awesome. And he wrote back just saying, something about the mountains.
This cone just sitting here simply.
Yeah,
it's really beautiful.
Taking in the beauty.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing all these stories, and everyone should go pick up a copy of Jeff Smalldon's book. If you want a signed copy, come to Clintonville Books. We have them in stock. That Beast Was Not Me. Jeff, your life is the thing of movies, and we might actually see a feature film of the book in the future. We're all crossing our fingers for that and cheering on that project that we just heard about. Thanks for coming to the store.
This was fun, Graham.
Yeah, and
I appreciate you having me, and great talking to you.
Yeah, to many more conversations.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll see you next time.